well. Peter is a professor at Boston College. And, oh, you can't hear me.
Luckily, there's a microphone. Peter is from Boston College, and he's a professor of psychology, developmental psychology is his specialty. And he has written psychology textbooks, he's a blogger for Psychology Today, and of course he's written a book. Let's see, so I'm probably not going to do much more of an introduction. I'll let Peter take over. And let's give him a warm welcome to Hamilton.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for being here on this beautiful day. I'm going to start my timer here to try to stay within an hour so that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. You all have the handout that I guess if you picked up when you came in. If there's anybody who does it, maybe somebody can bring it around if you raise your hand. But it's useful to have that in front of you. The front of the handout is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about. And the back of the handout is really there just so you'll know I'm a college professor. So there are references there. Whenever, especially when I'm talking about something that is not absolutely intuitive to everybody, it runs a little bit counter to many people's beliefs, runs a little counter, very much counter to much of what we've been taught, in this case about education. I like to provide documentation. I like to let you know that I'm not just making this stuff up, that in fact there are research studies, that there's evidence that I'm referring to. And so that's why I list a number of academic articles and books and studies on the back. So I'm an evolutionary psychologist. As Erin said, I'm a developmental psychologist, but I'm also an evolutionary psychologist, which means I'm interested in human nature. I'm interested in how that nature came about by natural selection. And as a developmental psychologist, of course, I'm especially interested in the nature of human children. And I'm most especially interested in those aspects of children's nature that came about in the course of natural selection to serve the function of their education. So the thesis that I'm talking about today is this, that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. We don't have to educate children. We could change our entire frame of thinking and talking and language about education so that instead of it being something that we do to children, in which we are the active educators and children are the passive ones being educated by us adults, we begin to think of education as something that children do for themselves. And that our job is not to educate them, but our job is to provide the conditions that optimize their abilities to educate themselves. I think the easiest way to glide into this idea is to think about little children. Until very recent times, we never thought about teaching little children. But think of all they learned. Think of all they learned before they ever reached school age. They learn their whole native language from scratch. They learn an enormous amount about the physical and social world around them. They are constantly exploring, they're constantly learning, they're little learning machines. And then we kind of close that off when we send them to school. We kind of put them into a situation where their natural learning mechanisms no longer really work because we shut off the conditions, we close off the conditions that allow them to work when that happens. So I'm going to define education. I do confess that I define education somewhat differently depending on who I'm speaking to. But when I speak to anthropologists, I define education this way. I define it as cultural transmission. It's the entire set of processes by which each new generation of human beings acquires the culture of the previous generation. Culture means the values, the skills, the knowledge, the lore, the ways of being of the previous generation. We have been the cultural animal ever since we've been human beings. We have been the animal that absolutely depends upon the acquisition of culture. We can't make it just by ourselves learning everything new from scratch. We survive by paying attention to and acquiring information, ideas, skills, mores, and so on from the previous generation. And that's what education is, by my definition. Schooling, as we know it, has been around for only a couple of hundred years in terms of a fairly large number of people being involved with it. But education has been with us ever since we have been human beings, if not before. At least for 1 million years, we've been this species that absolutely depends upon education. And yet, to the degree that we can tell by looking at those hunter-gatherer cultures that have skills that have survived, or survived at least into the 20th century, there was no thought that education was adults' responsibilities. It was always understood that this was something that children did for themselves. They paid attention, they practiced, they learned, they asked questions, they acquired what they needed to know to grow up to be effective adults. So, my argument is that over the course of this at least 1 million years, some would say 2 million years, some would say 5 million years, natural selection endowed us with certain instincts, which I am going to call here educative instincts. Natural, powerful drives to learn about the world around us, especially when we're young. We don't lose those drives, but they're especially prominent when we are young. So I've listed them here. I've listed some of those characteristics here under A on the handout, the educative instincts, which underlie self-directed education. So one of them is curiosity. You know, Aristotle in his Metaphysics, the very first sentence was, "Man is a curious animal," by which he didn't mean that we're an odd animal. He meant that we are curious. We human beings are by nature curious. That was his first proclamation about the origin of knowledge. Nothing could be more obvious. Every infant is curious about his world, almost from the moment of birth, the moment they can see anything. They're looking at new things more than they are looking at things that they've already seen. As soon as they can move, whatever their movement capability is, it's used for the purpose of exploration. They're reaching for things, they're grabbing for things, they're mouthing things. They are dropping things in order to see what happens. They are constantly into things because they're just constantly exploring the world. They're little scientists. Every normal child is this. They are driven by curiosity to explore the world. And this doesn't go away magically when children turn school age, but we sometimes drive it out because suddenly now we say their questions and what they want to know the answer to. That's not important. What's important is the curriculum that we're trying to teach them, which isn't really, for the most part, even interesting to the teacher. It's just something that the school system has said, this is the curriculum and we have to teach this. So now we put children in a situation where we shut off their curiosity. Playfulness, the drive to practice and create. Playfulness, children all over the world spend enormous amounts of time playing when they're allowed to do so. And when they're playing at those kinds of activities that they have to become good at. So whereas curiosity is how you learn about the world, you acquire information, you acquire understanding about the world by exploring, by questioning, and so on. Play is how you acquire skills. Play is how children practice the kinds of activities that they need to become skillful at in order to grow into effective older children and ultimately to effective adults. Children all over the world play whenever they have the chance to, and they play in certain predictable ways. They play when children have the full opportunity to play. They play at essentially all the kinds of skills that are important for human beings to develop. So they play in physical ways, which is how they develop strong muscles and good hearts and lungs and graceful movements and ability to manipulate things with their hands. They play in risky ways. They climb trees too high and they run along cliffs, and that's how they develop courage. That's how they learn to tolerate fear, to put themselves into fearful situations and say, I can do that. And that's how they develop the ability to deal with fear throughout their life. All mammals play in these ways. The other ways of play that I'm going to list here are uniquely human. Children everywhere play with language. Children learn language in play. The first cooing and babbling is always playful. It's always when the child is in a playful mood. The first words are never used to ask for anything. They're always in the spirit of play. And as children get older, they play with language in a variety of ways, alliterations and rhymes and riddles and turning the grammar upside down as they play with language and become skilled with language. They play socially. Children always want to play with other kids. More than anything else in the world, they want to play with other kids. We are the social animal. You have to learn how to get along with other people as equals. And the way to do that is to play with other children. You can't really learn how to get along with other people with equals if you're just interacting with adults, because there's a certain sense in which you're not equals with an adult, in which the adult is dominant over you, has power over you, has authority over you. So if you're going to learn how to get along with peers, you have to play with peers. You have to be able to interact with other people who are roughly your age. They play at building things, constructive play. What they construct varies from culture to culture, but in every culture where children are given sufficient time to play, they play at building things. We are the animal with opposable thumbs. We're the animal that survives by creating, building our environment, building means of conveyance, building tools, and so on. And children everywhere practice at building in constructive play. They play games with rules. In our culture, the games with rules tend to be competitive games. We're sort of a competitive culture. Children, when they play by themselves away from adults, don't play nearly as competitively, as often competitively as when adults are involved. We tend to force them into competitive play. But children, by choice in our culture, do tend to play competitive games more so than, let's say, hunter-gatherer cultures do, who are growing up in a non-competitive culture. But hunter-gatherer cultures, as well as our Western cultures, have games with rules. In their cultures, in hunter-gatherer cultures, these games with rules are more like dance-like games, cooperative games, keeping things going. But still, you have to follow explicit rules to do so. Well, we are, among other things, an animal that has to follow rules. We, in every society, to live in society, we have rules that we have to follow, that we agree upon. These are the rules, and children are practicing following rules when they're playing games with rules. And I'm actually, if this were a talk specifically on play, I would argue that in some sense all games, all play has rules. The rules are more often implicit than explicit, however. Children play imaginative, they play fantasy games, they play let's pretend kinds of games. And what are they doing there? They're practicing what really is the highest manner of human thinking, the ability to think about things that aren't actually present. Presumably, we are the only animal capable of doing this. We can't know this for sure because we can't climb into the mind of a dolphin or a chimpanzee. But as far as can be told, we can tell by overt behavior, we are the only animal that creates hypotheses and thinks hypothetically. We are probably the only animal that thinks consciously about tomorrow. And tomorrow never happens. So every time we think about tomorrow, we are using our imagination. And children in play are constantly practicing the use of their imagination. They play with logic. They play, if this is true, then that has to be true. That's also often part of imaginative play. Listen to even young children talking about the logical connections between one kind of activity and another activity. They play with the tools of the culture. In hunter-gatherer cultures, they play with bows and arrows and digging sticks and knives and fire. In our culture, they play with computers, and why shouldn't they? It's the major tool of our culture, and every child can't help but look around and say, not necessarily consciously, but say kind of in their gut, if there's any tool in this culture that I'm growing up in that I need to master, it is that computer. So of course our children are going to play with computers, but they also play with the other tools of our culture. They look around and they see these things and they play with them and become skilled with them. So that's play. That's another instinctive aspect of all human beings, and children as well as adults, is our sociability. We are the animal that depends upon our ability to cooperate and get along with other people. And one of the reasons that we depend upon other people is because we get information from other people. We communicate with other people. We want to know what other people know. If we don't know what other people know, we can't really get along with them, and we can't really survive in the culture that we're going into. So children come into the world curious, but they're especially curious about other people. They're especially curious about what other people are doing and how they do it, and they're especially curious about what other people know. And as they grow older, they're more and more using their language to explore one another's minds, and to explore the minds of adults too, to the degree that they have that opportunity. The most unique adaptation that we human beings have for our social life, that no other animal has, if anything like the degree that we have it, is language. With language, we form connections with other people. With language, we expand our knowledge enormously. And so isn't it interesting that children just naturally learn and acquire language, and once they begin to use language, once they learn it in play, they begin to use it to acquire information. They begin to ask questions. They begin to want to know what other people know. The philosopher Daniel Dennett once wrote, comparing our brains with bird brains or dolphin brains is almost beside the point, because our brains are in effect joined together into a single cognitive system that dwarfs all the others. They are joined by an innovation that has invaded our brain and no other's language. Our brains are networked. My brain is not just my individual brain that I use. My brain is the brains of everybody through our connections. And of course, with the internet, those connections have expanded exponentially. So I want to illustrate how these three, before I go on to a couple of more educative instincts, let me illustrate with an example how these three educative instincts in children interact to produce education, to allow children to educate themselves. I'll take an example that some of you may know of. Sugata Mitra. How many know who Sugata Mitra is? So he's got this great TED Talk, but he did a study, really it was almost 20 years ago now, it's hard to believe it was that long ago, in the late 1990s, he did a study that he initially was calling the hole-in-the-wall experiment. He was the head of an educational technology firm in India, in New Delhi. And the firm, one of the walls of the building that he worked in faced one of the poorest slums in New Delhi. A lot of street children, not going to school. And he, as an experiment, he made a computer available to them. He put a computer in a hole in the wall of the building, and so it was facing out onto the street. And the only thing he did, he also kind of videotaped it so we could keep a record of what was going on, and also monitored the activity. They monitored the activity of the computer, monitored what was going on. So all he did then was tell the kids, you can play with this thing. He didn't tell them anything about it. They'd never seen a computer before. This was back before computers were so common. It looked like some kind of a television set maybe to them. And curiosity led them to explore this thing. And so they would come up to it, they would touch various things, and when they touched various things, sometimes something would happen on the screen. And over the course of really just a few days, many of the kids learned how really to use all of the functions of the computer. They became what Mitra called computer literate. And over further time, once he supplied an internet connection to it, they would download music, they would download games, they would do all the things that kids do everywhere in the world with computers, all discovered completely by themselves. So curiosity led them to make these discoveries, but then playfulness led them to play with these discoveries. So for example, they might download a drawing program, and then they would playfully draw pictures with it and become good at computer drawing. Or they might download some kind of a word program and playfully work at writing out notes or that kind of thing and play at that. So curiosity brought them to the computer, gave them the information. Playfulness let them be skilled with various aspects of the computer. And sociability is what led every person's discovery to be the discovery not just for themselves, but for all the other kids in the neighborhood. The kids almost never played all by themselves. They were there with a bunch of kids. So one person makes a discovery, and lo and behold, everybody discovers it. And then one person who has a friend in another group goes and tells them about it, and they come and try it out. So, at one time at least, we had this idea of one laptop for every child in the world would be a great innovation for education. Mitra's thought that you don't need one laptop for every child. He thinks it's better if you have a lot of children on one computer because they're learning from one another when that is happening. So this is an example of how curiosity, playfulness, and sociability creates education. My argument is this is the way education has always occurred traditionally. This is how children have always become educated. The third characteristic that I've listed here is willfulness, the drive to be in charge of your own life. Children don't want to do what we want them to do, they want to do what they want to do, which can be annoying sometimes. But thank goodness they do, because otherwise they would be dependent on us their whole lives. They know beginning almost from birth on, certainly by the age of 2, they want independence. They want as much independence as they can manage. They want to get away from control. They want to explore what they want to explore, play at what they want to play at, socialize with whom they want to socialize with. And that's part of education, because ultimately the goal of every child is to become an independent person, a person who can run their own life. And they want to practice doing that right from the beginning. And the fifth thing I've listed here is plannedfulness, the drive to think about and make plans for the future. This is the most conscious part of our educative drives, the most conscious of our educative drives. And it develops a little more slowly than the other characteristics. It's not necessarily present right from birth. But as children get older, they begin to think about the future. They begin to, not necessarily the long distance future, but maybe what is it I want to do tomorrow, and how do I have to get prepared for it, or what do I want to do? And ultimately they do begin to think, in our culture, how am I going to make a living? What do I need to do? What are my goals in life? What do I want to try to accomplish? We human beings almost can't help but think about the future and then begin to make plans for the future. And children at some point, when they're free to do so, when they're free to be in charge of their own education, start taking a more conscious approach to what they're doing. If I want to do this, then I kind of have to learn this. So there's this somewhat more disciplined aspect to self-directed education that begins to emerge as children get older. They're still, of course, learning through play and exploration and all kinds of more spontaneous kinds of activities and through the experiences of life itself. But they're also beginning now to think about what it is that they want to do and how to prepare themselves for what they want to do.